Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site, bettingangle.us, a free site. It's October 22nd, 2025. Let's talk Haney. Let's talk Norman. Let's talk Wardley. Let's talk Parker. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, first, a little preface. Gold and silver are near all-time highs. I've tagged some offerings which are available for sale. Take a look at it. Okay? Folks, not all outcomes are created equally. Certain outcomes have outlier effects. Right? I want people to look hard at this upcoming welterweight fight between Brian Norman, who throws a great left hook, and Devin Haney, who has a problem with left hooks, but who has great feet, who has great movement. On paper, it's supposed to be Haney's entry fight into the welterweight division. In reality, you understand that Haney is one of these guys who balloons in weights between fights. Right? This is not Bernard Hopkins. This is not Evander Holyfield. This is not Vitaly Klitschko. This is not the guy who's always in shape. No, this is a guy who lives a little between fights. This is more Ricky Hatton than it is Evander Holyfield. But here's what I want people to consider. Brian Norman is pocket-centric. If Brian Norman wins the fight, and I'm not going to give a prediction, I'm going to save that for premium subscribers. If Brian Norman wins the fight, he's all dressed up with nowhere to go. In other words, his opponents would be other welters. Right? Maybe he fights Mario Barrios. Maybe he tries to get inside of Barrios' long reach and jab. Right? Maybe he fights Teofimo Lopez. But understand, those are the guys he would be trying to fight. Maybe Shakur Stevenson actually comes up to welterweight and fights Brian Norman. But what Norman can't do, and I'm not saying here necessarily that Haney's better than Norman, but boxing's about styles. What Brian Norman, in my opinion, can't do is jump to 154. Right? Because he's going to want a pocket to form. Guess what? Murtazaliyev's going to want a pocket to form. Guess what? Sebastian Fundora is going to want a pocket to form. You know, one of the things you don't do against Keith Thurman is allow a pocket to form. In other words, he, because of his style, right, and it's championship level, because of his style, this is the guy who, even with the great left hook, is going to have a problem with bigger men. Right? 154, the guys are bigger. Sebastian Fundora is much taller than Brian Norman. Right? He's going to have a problem with bigger men who are open to shootouts. Think about it. Tim Tszyu's in the ring against Murtazaliyev. Blown out. Right? Murtazaliyev in that fight's not running from Tim Tszyu. Tim Tszyu has a punch. Right? Blown out. Now, for all his flaws, right? You know, the guy talks a little bit more than he does in the ring, quite frankly. Right? Just understand Devin Haney. Great legs. Right? There's a school of thought that believes that Brian Norman's not going to be able to find Devin Haney in the ring. Right? Just understand, with Devin Haney, the question flips itself. Right? 154. If Devin Haney comes in with footwork, does Murtazalia find him? Is there a point where the bigger guys become too clunky? The bigger guys become too relatively uncoordinated. Right? Devin Haney with a jab, with movement, in my opinion, is actually viable at 154 in a way that Brian Norman, whoever wins this fight, is not. Right? Brian Norman, and don't get me wrong, Brian Norman's a skilled counterpuncher and stuff like that. That hurts you if you're fighting a guy with a jab who can hit you with shots and be too far outside for you to immediately bridge the gap and counter them. Right, folks? The gap in height between Brian Norman and Sebastian Fundora is over half a foot. Look it up. Right? Norman has a different problem. Let's say Norman is facing Virgil Ortiz. Let's speculate here that Ortiz beats Erickson Lubin. Right, folks? You know the first rule to fighting Virgil Ortiz is to be aware of his jab. It's one of the best in the sport. Right? If I'm a counterpuncher and I'm getting hit with a jab, suddenly those counters become harder, don't they? Also, not all jabs are created equally. For some guys, a jab is just a punch that stings. You understand, with other guys, Monzon, Holmes, Virgil Ortiz, that jab is what Sergio Mora calls a power jab. Right? If Virgil Ortiz is landing his jab on you and you can't get by it, he doesn't have to throw anything else. I'm serious about that. In other words, if it lines up where Virgil Ortiz can keep you outside with his left jab and your left hook never becomes a factor because you're getting hit with this jab and Ortiz is rolling away from the left hook, you're going to be in trouble. Now, that's not the case with Devin Haney. Right? A guy with legs and a back foot who has timing can figure out how to move away from a Virgil Ortiz so that power jab doesn't land. Right? Haney, because he's more mobile than Ortiz, might be able to pick the angles of engagement. Right? So, just understand too, Virgil Ortiz, I believe people in the sport know, he's having a problem making weight. He's had a problem making weight at other weight classes lower down. Now it's catching up to him at 154. Right? He really belongs at 160. But there's a guy at 160. His name's Janabek. And people aren't ready to fight him. So let me just say, a weight-drained slugger like Virgil Ortiz, who went the distance his last fight against Madrimov, didn't he? Right? Against a Devin Haney who could move. Right? Who's going to say, hey, player, put the jab away. It's not going to find me. I'm prepared for the jab. I've looked at your films. Right? What's your plan B? I'm over here. Oh, no, I'm over here. Oh, no, I'm over here. Right? That guy can turn it into an Ali, Sonny Liston, who had a great jab, but didn't have the feet affair. Right? So what I want people to think about is what exactly happens if Devin Haney beats Norman Right, folks? I'm telling you, several people are going to have to be on guard. If Haney announces that he is going up to 154, you have to take that seriously. Now, let me add something here. There are guys at 154 who can move, right? Not just Ennis, but Xander Zayas, right? Keith Thurman's actually pretty adept in terms of moving around the ring. I'm not saying Haney shows up at 154 and cleans out the division, because it's a deep division with different styles. But what I am saying is that Devin Haney, whoever wins the Brian Norman fight, and as I pointed out, Haney got dropped by Ryan Garcia's left hook, right? Brian Norman throws a mean left hook. Boxing's a sport where a puncher only has to be right once. Haney can get caught, could get dropped by Norman. That doesn't mean Norman would be better than him at 154. Let's talk about Fabio Wardley against Joe Parker. I need for people to understand that Parker, number one, is on a historical run. Right? Don't get too caught up in the present. Right? Just understand that at a time when Deontay Wilder was returning to the sport and, we thought, wow, Wilder's going to be tough and people are going to have to stay away from Deontay Wilder. We all knew that Wilder's straight right was one of the most dangerous punches in the entire sport. Right? We knew that. Well, guess what? Joe Parker against the guy with a big right hand forces Wilder to go the distance. Doesn't get dropped in the fight. Right? This isn't the, two of the Wilder Tyson Fury fights where Fury gets dropped multiple times. Right? Joe Parker outboxes Deontay Wilder. Beats him. Joe Parker does get dropped by Zhilei Zhang. As I keep telling people, with Zhang, the water is deeper than you think. But Joe Parker had more volume than Zhilei Zhang. Joe Parker finished well. Joe Parker got the decision on Zhilei Zhang. I'm telling you that if a fight were announced between Usyk and Martin Bakole, right? To me, the betting side of the play is clear. It's Martin Bakole. I don't think the styles match up. I'll agree with those who say, look, if Usyk can push this past the 6th round, Bakole's going to start to fade. Right? I'll agree with them. Right? Just understand Bakole goes the distance with Efe Ajagba. It's not like Bakole, at the start of the 7th just falls to the canvas. Right? And for the first 6 rounds, Bakole, who is sparred with Usyk, would be in Usyk's face. Right? That's the kind of fighter who I think would give Usyk problems. I think Usyk would lose to young Mike Tyson, for example. Right? A guy who can come in, cut off the ring, bob, weave, move his head, have head movement, force the issue, have the attitude of, okay, I'm willing to take your punch if you're willing to take mine, and actually have the horsepower behind his own punch to hurt Usyk. Right? You know where I stand, too. And I'm a big fan of Usyk. People think when I'm here and I'm criticizing Crawford, I'm criticizing Usyk, they ignore all the videos where I praise the guys. They focus on that video. Then they think I have something personal. Right, folks? You know where I stand. I feel that Daniel Dubois landed a legit shot to Usyk's body. Usyk hit the canvas. The referee made a mistake. And Usyk, after 5 minutes on the canvas, was able to get up and beat Dubois. So I look at Usyk's body, and I feel the way Arthur Beterbiev does, a guy who fought Usyk in the amateurs. I think Usyk's body might be his Achilles. Right? Just understand, Joe Parker beat Martin Bakole. Right? He did so in such a way where if you look at the knockout, Bakole gets hit so hard that Bakole, who has a big mouth, talks a big game, clearly didn't want to continue. Right? Boxers know how to let the ref know, hey, I don't want to continue. Right? Bakole turns his back to the referee. Think about that. Turns his back to the referee. Walks over to the corner, looks like he's talking to a guy in the corner. Now, what I need for people to understand is Fabio Wardley does have one of the best right hands in boxing. But if you can roll away from it, if you know how to deal with a guy with a big right hand, he's beatable. Right, folks? He was getting beaten by Justice Haney. Right? Understand, too. Joe Parker's a guy who already beat Deontay Wilder, who had one of the biggest right hands in boxing, just like Fabio Wardley does. Now, while I believe Martin Bakole, because he's a long-range hooker, two-handed guy, unique, really can't prepare for him, right? I will agree with those who believe Efe Ajagba beat him. I thought Ajagba did. They call that fight a draw, right? Welcome to boxing. But let me just point out that Fabio Wardley against an Alexander Usyk would have a hard time. Right? Fabio Wardley against Justice Haney in a rematch would have a hard time. Right? Against master boxers, Fabio Wardley is going to have a hard time because he doesn't have the full extent of tools that Joe Parker has. Right? Parker is a wild card. I understand. Parker had a problem with Joe Joyce's jab, just as Daniel Dubois did. I understand Joe Joyce walks him down, knocks him out. Right? Thank God for that fight. Because I don't think the betting public understands how good Joe Parker is. Thank God for that fight. Because I'm looking at the Wardley odds and I see Joe Parker going off at less than a minus 400. I'm thinking, whoa, wait. Is this after Wardley's last fight? Do people remember what happened in the Haney fight? You're getting bettable odds on Joe Parker. I don't think the public's aware of the fact that Joe Parker would give most fighters in the heavyweight division all they can handle, including guys who have beaten him in the past. Right? Dillian White, AJ. Folks, I'm not sure if they could beat this version of Joe Parker. So understand, Fabio Wardley, if he beats Joe Parker, I'm expecting Usyk, who's still hanging around the sport. Someone in the comment section explain it to me. Right? I wouldn't be surprised if Usyk says, okay, well, Fabio Wardley's done the hard work for me. Let me fight him. Right? Because Usyk would be in the ring knowing, okay, I got to look for that big overhand right hand. I'm a southpaw as it is. Let me set it up so that, I'm facing that right hand. I'm fixated on it. I'm able to outbox him. I'm able to get him up on the ropes as Haney did, as Usyk did to Daniel Dubois. Let me throw my Ivan punch as a counter. Let me dust him off. Right? He can't say that with Joe Parker. Look at the first Andy Ruiz fight. Now, I'll agree that fight's close. I believe if that very fight was fought in the United States, Ruiz, who ended up winning the heavyweight title anyway against AJ, if that fight against Parker were in the United States, I believe Ruiz would win that fight. But what I want people to do in looking at that fight is understand Ruiz, even today, is blessed with hand speed. Parker is on his back foot. Parker's not a Martin Bacoli slugger type. Parker has the back foot. Parker beats Ruiz on his back foot. Right? You're dealing with a guy who, quite frankly, has a higher skill level than Fabio Wardley. There is the distinct possibility that if Parker beats Wardley, Usyk decides not to fight him. Right? Understand, Parker beat Bacoli. Right? Usyk could have silenced the Bacoli crowd by saying, hey, I'll fight the guy who beat Bacoli. Right? Everyone thinks I'm afraid to fight guys. I'll fight Joe Parker. He could have announced that fight. The public looking at Parker's resume, his recent resume, right? Wilder, Zhili Zhang, Martin Bacoli, the public would have said, yeah, well, he's earned a shot. Then Usyk, instead of requesting more time, only to be filmed in a disco and stuff like that, Usyk could have said, hey, I've knocked off Joe Parker. Who's next? Instead, that's not the path he's taken, is it? Right? If Parker wins this fight, I'll be surprised if Usyk runs to fight him. I wouldn't even be surprised if Usyk announces he's taking time off from the sport. Right? People might recall that Vitaly Klitschko at one point was the champion emeritus in recess. Right? Usyk, unbeaten, could say, hey, I'm going to take time off. Right? I have some lingering injuries, or gee, I have a kid who's about to graduate from 5th grade, whatever the reason. Right? And, I believe the sanctioning bodies would say, okay, cool. Take time off. When you come back, we'll give you a title shot. Right? And, of course, he conveniently might wait until Joe Parker eventually loses to decide to come back. What I need for people to understand is, while Fabio Wardley can knock out anyone with that right hand, if Joe Parker wins the Wardley fight, that opens up the possibilities in the heavyweight division. Right? Parker's on a great run, folks. Right? This is one of the best runs I've seen a heavyweight contender have. Right? If Parker becomes heavyweight champ again, the storylines make themselves. Obviously, the fight that sells itself would be Parker against Usyk. But just understand, Parker AJ. Parker wanted to fight inside. This is a younger Parker who, by his own admission now, wasn't that excited about boxing. The referee wouldn't allow him to. Right? Different refs have different ways of doing things. I'm not alleging corruption or anything like that. I'm just saying Parker wanted to turn it into a mudslinging contest inside the pocket, the referee wouldn't allow him to. Right? Parker, Tyson Fury, his good buddy. Right? Parker's already beaten Huey Fury. Right? That'd be an interesting fight. Right? Daniel Dubois is trying to get a third fight against Usyk. Let's say Parker becomes heavyweight champion. Those two guys have never fought. Right? So, as we look at fights, let's think about the possibilities. I do believe clearly that Norman at 147 is an explosive fighter. He's very impressive. Excellent counterpuncher. Devastating left hook. Right, Fabio Wardley? It's shocking that a guy can come up from white-collar boxing, for crying out loud, and have the level of success that he's had. Guys like Fraser Clark were distinguished amateurs. Right? You know, David Adelaide, I privately believe, is one of the most dangerous men in the heavyweight division. Right? You know my feeling. He fought the wrong guy in fighting Philippe Ergovic, but that's another story. Right? Fabio Wardley beat him. Right? Wardley's a wild card. You know, that Fraser Clark rematch was interesting, wasn't it? The two guys came out. Fraser Clark, for all the talk, looked like he was there for a boxing match. Fabio Wardley, for all the talk, was actually there for a fight. That fight didn't make it out of the first round. Right? Wardley starts throwing that big right hand of his. Right? It's a lethal punch. But will he be able to land it on Joe Parker? Right? Let's remember, Deontay Wilder was unable to land his much shorter right hand on Joe Parker. Right? Straighter, I should say, not necessarily shorter. Anyway, those are my thoughts. You know, one of the great things with boxing is that suddenly there's an upset, or suddenly there's a decision or knockout, and the world changes. Right? Devin Haney has the kind of feat where he could get a title at 154 and then jump up to 160 and maybe show us how a mover would do against Janabek. Right? Brian Norman, excellent fighter. I think his next call, should he beat Devin Haney, would be, you know, Mario Barrios. Right? Murtazaliev, you know, sluggers at 154. Murtazaliev, Sebastian Fundora, right? Slugging with volume. You know, they'd be safe. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. In the comment section of this YouTube video, simply put, styles make fights. I believe Haney and Joe Parker would take boxing in a different direction, should they win, than Norman and Fabio Wardley. Let me hear your views in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.